Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. Today we are going to discuss America's forgotten war, the Korean War. Here are your learning targets for the day. It's essentially cause and effect. We'll describe the causes and the progress of the Korean War, and then we'll explore the long-term effects of the Korean War, including immediate effects, long-term effects, and United States membership in SEATO. So, just to review, last time Germany splits up into two countries, East Germany and West Germany. Stalin actually blockades West Berlin in an effort to choke off the entire city and get it for himself, but the US and Great Britain respond with the Berlin airlift, and the Soviets lift the blockade days over a year later. And NATO forms along with the Warsaw Pact, and those are defensive military alliances. So the Korean War essentially starts with China, because China in the 1930s, ever since 1927, was in a civil war between nationalist forces and communist forces. And at the beginning of World War II, China kind of stops their civil war for a little bit and decides to fight together and form a united front against Japan. Well, at the end of World War II, China resumes their civil war, and it's over in about 4 years after that. The U.S. starts to fund the nationalist forces in China because China is struggling against communism, so that would fall under the Truman Doctrine that we need to supply them. The nationalist forces are led by Chiang Kai-shek, and we give over $4 billion of aid, most of which is military equipment, and we actually pull a lot of our funding towards the end of the war because of corruption that's going on in the Chiang-led nationalist forces. And the Soviet Union gives the communist forces weapons. They give them confiscated Japanese weapons from Manchuria and other areas of China during World War II. And the communists are led by Mao Zedong. And pretty soon Mao is going to become the leader of China after the communists win. Sorry for the spoiler alert. But in May of 1949, communists take over all of mainland China, and Chiang and his government move to the island of Taiwan. And to this day, there has been no official treaty signed to end the war, and both governments claim to be the official government of China. Taiwan is officially known as the Republic of China, and China is the People's Republic of China. And so containment has already failed. A lot of U.S. politicians are upset that more aid wasn't given to Chiang's forces, but like I said, they were corrupt in using that aid. And so this, China falling to communism, and our eventual stalemate in the Korean War will lead to Americans replacing their fear of Nazism with communism and bringing in another Red Scare. We had a Red Scare in the 1920s with the Sacco and Vanzetti trial and the Palmer raids, if you remember those, but this Red Scare is going to be much more broader in scope, because we're going to start accusing people in the American government of being communist. But we'll talk about that later this chapter. And the Soviet Union, only 4 years after the United States detonates its nuclear bomb on Japan, the Soviets test their first nuclear bomb. This scares the absolute crap out of America because they're not supposed to have a bomb for 5 or 6 more in a year. So somebody in our government must have been spying for them. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about the Cold War at home. But the whole point is that we triple our military budgets because only a large military could contain communism. And we, as a part of containment, we then have to go to Korea. And Korea, it was imperialized nation by Japan from 1910 to 1945, and at the end of World War II, the Japanese forces surrendered to Soviet and U.S. troops at the 38th parallel, as you can see on the map here. So two nations developed. One south of it, South Korea, is democratic, and North Korea is communist. So the U.S. says everything's cool here, we don't need to keep troops anymore, so let's just send them back. But the Soviet Union sees a chance to attack and take over the whole peninsula. So they do. In 1950, North Korean forces sweep across the 38th parallel and attack and push all the way down to the tip of North Korea. 2 days later, Truman orders more troops to support South Korea as a part of containment and the Truman Doctrine. 16 nations send 520,000 troops to help South Korea's 590,000 troops. And General Douglas MacArthur uses this huge army to push all the way back up the peninsula to the Chinese border. And he wants to keep moving into China, but Truman won't let him. So these Chinese communists send forces across the border to aid the North. MacArthur then calls for nuclear weapons to be used against Chinese cities and military targets. And this is kind of controversial. He says he didn't. Some people say he did. But they did have the capability there in Southeast Asia to do this. So Truman rejects his request because China is backed by the Soviet Union. And if we bomb China, then the Soviet Union could attack us and start World War III. So Truman eventually fires MacArthur in 1951. As for the rest of the war, there is a ceasefire in 1951 and an armistice reached in 1953, or a temporary peace agreement. The costs are tens of thousands of Americans killed, over 100,000 wounded, prisoner of war, or missing in action, and it costs $67 billion. The situation today, since the war has never been officially declared over, some people say it's just a long ceasefire. Every now and again, the North will fire on the South because the South thrives economically. They're a big trading partner of the United States. North Korea is still communist. They suffer from famine and energy shortages, and their new leader, their old leader passed away a couple of years ago, Kim Jong-il. His son, Kim Jong-un, pictured here with the baby face, is their new leader. And so he and his father and his grandfather have ruled Korea since the World War II era. So here's a little chart of the problems that were going on and the solutions that the United States gave. And then finally, the immediate effects of the war's impact on America and the long-term effects. Let's focus on the immediate first. There's tens of thousands of Americans killed, over 100,000 wounded. This worsens our relations with China, especially now that they're communist, and we won't officially recognize communist China until the 1970s when Nixon makes a visit there. And of course, the armed forces during the Korean War were racially integrated. And the long-term effects is we see an increase in our military spending. By the end of the 50s, by 1950, it'll be half of our federal budget is military spending. Worldwide military commitments increase. We have over 1 million troops stationed in places like Germany, Japan, now Korea. We have to occupy and make sure that things stay cool. Our relations with Japan improve because they see that we are against the Soviet Union and dedicated to make sure that communism does not spread. And future presidents will now send military into combat without congressional approval. This was not ever an official war, so to speak. I mean, the last time we declared war in the United States was World War II against Japan and Germany. And future presidents won't need congressional approval. That's how we'll get so deep into the Vietnam War, and a lot of people say it's a mistake.
The end of World War II brought renewed violence in a long-running Chinese Civil War. In 1949, Communist leader Mao Zedong launched an all-out offensive to defeat Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government. American efforts to mediate an end to the conflict failed, and Chiang's government was forced to flee into exile. At home, conservatives blamed President Truman's administration for what they called the loss of China to communism. News that the Soviets had successfully tested their first atomic bomb and a series of sensational spy cases convinced many that the enemy had seized the initiative in the Cold War. In June 1950, these fears seemed to be confirmed when the Communist Army of North Korea launched a blistering attack against its neighbor, South Korea. Within days, they had overrun the capital of Seoul and forced the defending South Korean army into full retreat. The North Korean invasion was the first military challenge of the Cold War. How the United States responded to the threat was critically important. Following World War II, Korea was temporarily divided at the 38th parallel and jointly occupied by the United States in the south and the Soviet Union in the north. The Soviets turned North Korea into a communist state. They installed into power a dictator named Kim Il-sung. In South Korea, the United States established a pro-Western government under Syngman Rhee, an oppressive yet fanatically anti-communist leader. Both Rhee and Kim aspired to unite Korea under their own rule, but neither the U.S. nor the Soviet Union would allow their client states to stir war. That changed in 1950. Kim finally convinced Joseph Stalin to support his invasion of South Korea. Kim would provide the troops, Stalin would supply the military hardware, and Mao Zedong, if it became necessary, would provide Chinese reinforcements. Kim promised that victory would be swift and decisive. But it would be neither. Half a world away, the North Korean invasion sparked intense debate in Washington. Was the assault ordered by the Soviets? Was this the beginning of World War III? President Truman and his advisors quickly decided to take action.
An act of aggression such as this creates a very real danger to the security of all free nations. This challenge has been presented squarely. We must meet it squarely.
The U.S. acted through the United Nations. Their mandate was explicit: repel the attack and restore peace to the area. A coalition of 15 countries agreed to send troops. But the overwhelming majority of fighting men were American, fighting under General Douglas MacArthur to defend American interests in the region. In diplomatic language, it was termed a police action, but it was a war. In the words of military historian Slam Marshall, the century's nastiest little war. General MacArthur rushed his troops to the battlefront. But the ill-prepared units were completely overwhelmed by the disciplined North Korean army, fighting with Soviet tanks and artillery. Within a month, MacArthur's army had retreated to the tip of the Korean peninsula, near Busan, while plans were laid for a daring amphibious landing behind enemy lines at the port of Incheon. If it were successful, the North Korean army could be trapped. If it failed, UN forces might be wiped out entirely. The assault at Incheon came on September 15, 1950. It was a gauntlet. Dangerous currents, extraordinary tides, defense fortifications, and massive seawalls. One planner described the obstacles. We drew up a list of every natural and geographic handicap, and Incheon had all of them. Despite the challenges, the invasion was a stunning success. Within days, the capital city of Seoul was liberated. With the restoration of South Korea, the UN mission had been accomplished.
And then finally, we do have some collective security in Southeast Asia when SEATO is formed, or the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. It's a defensive alliance aimed at preventing the spread of communism, and you can see the countries there, not all of them being in Southeast Asia.